son, where'd you find this?
Buckle up, buttercups. It's time to get down to business. Oh, yeah. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Totally legit.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back again with another episode of the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. And today we have a certified entertainment industry legend, Mr. Donnie Graves. Thank you for coming on the show, Donnie.
Thanks for having me, James. Nice to see you again.
It's been a while. You know, we spent a fair amount of time together that one summer you guys were getting that apartment set up in New York, and I've been out to California a couple times, but I haven't really been out to California since COVID. I need to come back out there.
Yeah, it's time. And that's funny that COVID for some people was 2 years long. For us, it was kind of 4 years long, and part of it continues, and part of it's kind of rolled by, and it's almost like 2 of those 4 years didn't even exist. So
it's the same kind of situation here. People don't like to refer to it, and in New York, we just pretend like it didn't happen. It was a very unsettling time here.
Well, in the early days, when it became the day the Earth stood still, my friend Joseph Arthur, the musical genius, he was living in Brooklyn at the time, but he went and wandered around the most crowded avenues traditionally of Manhattan, and took photographs and video of himself, himself laying on 6th Avenue and laying on 9th Avenue at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, it really did feel like Vanilla Sky. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it was just, I had a knee surgery, so I had to go into PT, and I was doing a couple doctor's visits, and it was just so surreal going into Midtown and there just being nobody. But here we are. We're beyond that. We've emerged out of that cocoon into the beautiful moth of the world that we have now. And, you've always interested me. I met you through Dan Jones, I think.
That's correct.
In New York. And he prefaced, he was like, this guy's a legend. Okay, you're going to love him. And I was like, not, and I wasn't disappointed by any means. You're probably one of the first people in the entertainment industry that wasn't just a total dick. And there were so many of those, especially in New York. It was just like a refreshing, I remember the weekend we were getting that apartment set up, it was just like a refreshing kind of situation. But for the people that listen to this show, could you tell them what you do? And then we'll go all the way back to the beginning about how you got involved doing it.
Well, today, my dear wife, Donnie Graves, and I own an experiential marketing agency called Encompass. And experiential marketing is when, you do things that actually touch people, real face-to-face activities. And anyway, we've been incredibly lucky. Don and I started this company. She started. I was drug and kicking and screaming about 20 years ago. And we do a lot of things with video gaming. We do a lot of things with film and television. We do a little bit of stuff with sport activity. I think there'll be probably more sport moving forward. And oddly enough, I had tried on several occasions to leave the music business. And like the mob, you're not allowed to leave. So every time I thought that I'd made it across the river and no one had seen me, there was no searchlights after me, I'd walk 10 feet right into the arms of another person I had to do business with. So at Encompass, I wouldn't consider us a sponsorship agency by any stretch of the imagination, but we did, over the years, it seems about every 2 or 3 years we do some major tour, whether it was, U2's 360 tour or the Police's reunion tour. In those cases, with BlackBerry sponsored the U2 tour, and Best Buy, who had been a client for many, many, many years, sponsored the Police reunion tour. I mean, they and we were even semi-responsible for that reunion tour, but I won't get way out on the weeds on it. So, so Metallica, Guitar Hero, things like that. So it does give us a chance. The music business that you've probably been talking about when you do talk about the music business is ever changing, and has changed yet again post-COVID. So that's what we've been doing recently. Going backwards, while that was going on, as I told you, I spent a decent amount of time still doing music things, I've started getting back into music again as a manager, which is how I kind of started my career.
Love that.
Or the early part of my career. And I took an off-ramp into a cul-de-sac called motorsport, where I spent about a decade managing professional racing drivers, which for me felt pretty much like managing rock stars. They're very, very similar in personalities, although some racing drivers are much better at getting up early in the morning than
Yeah, sure.
Other than that, a lot of similarities. So yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of what I've been doing recently, but my life's been kind of one big thing since I was 13 or 14 years old.
So I remember you briefly kind of telling me when we first met how you kind of got into all this stuff, but you break that down for us. So you're a young lad deciding what you want to do with your life. How do you initially get involved with like event production? Well, I mean, I didn't really have a plan, and I was blessed with parents who didn't have a plan for me. They were kind of whatever you want to do seems like a pretty good idea. Good luck and hope we don't have to visit you in prison. Was right.
The attitude. But, I was a 10-year-old kid that had records. I didn't have a lot of friends. There are people who will lie about that and say that I was a social kid, but I don't think at 10 I was as social as I am today. But anyway, my friends back then were, animals in the wild and dogs and record albums, LPs. And I spent a lot of time listening to music, and as a result, I spent a lot of time buying music. Back in those days, you could only buy music on vinyl. That's the way you got it, and you could listen to it on the radio, and I did a little bit of both. But I spent a tremendous amount of time at a record store in Atlanta, Georgia, called Budget Tapes and Records, in an area called Buckhead, which is famous in Atlanta today. And I was up there all the time, and I think when I was around 13 years old, the proprietor was a fellow by the name of David Finger, who asked me the question, "Are you rich?" And I said, "Well, no, why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, you spend $75 a week in this store. And in 1972 or $73, that was about $350 a week." So it looked like I was spending I was spending a crazy amount of money on music because that's all I did. So he said, "Well,
Sure.
You can come work for me. If you come work here, I'll pay you wholesale, and your $75 will turn into $150 worth of purchasing power." And I signed up. So I wasn't a gifted student, but I was enough of a hustler that I was able to get out of school a little bit early, around 1 p.m., and I'd ride my bicycle over to this record store, and we'd sit down behind the counter and talk about new releases, and David would start drinking, and by about sundown, he would be passed out, and David, God rest his soul, is now passed on, so I don't feel too terrible about telling this story, but he would pass out in a mattress in the storeroom, and I would continue to keep the store open and do my homework, and spent a decent amount of time doing that. The store got purchased. I'm not going to get into details about how that happened and who got the money, but long story short, the store got purchased. I ended up working for another record store, which actually a chain called Peaches, that was kind of like Tower, but pre-Tower. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I ended up going to work at a club called the Agora Ballroom. That was the second of a series of clubs that started in Cleveland, Ohio, that was owned by the Lacani family, very well-known music people in Cleveland, Ohio. And I learned a tremendous amount. I learned a great deal about the music business and the record business working in retail records for about 2 or 3 years. A lot of legendary people like Charlie Minor, who was a very famous radio promotion guy. You can look him up. There's many pages on him and radio promotion. He got gifts from people like Michael Jackson of Rolls Royces and for doing a really great job. But anyway, I met a lot of those guys on the way up, and they were characters, and they were interesting, and they made their own rules. And as a result of working with these guys as a young teen, it kind of set my sights, I guess, towards a life. It seemed like an adventurous life, but I didn't have a plan. I was just kind of making up as I was going along. Oh, anyway, one thing I will say is when I was working at that record store, when I was running that record store, I occasionally would get a chance to go do roadie work. I would get a chance to go help set up the stage when the Rolling Stones played the Atlanta Stadium. I got invited to go down to New Orleans and set up the stage when the Rolling Stone played New Orleans. Mainly, I was cheap labor. But in those early days, those mid '70s days, when you were building the stage, you also got a chance to hang out with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards because they were not really sequestered away in dressing rooms, because the dressing rooms in those days were production trailers.
Right.
They weren't very glamorous, so there were as many rock stars backstage playing Frisbee as there were hiding out. So it was a completely different world. It was a great adventure. I really wanted to get into that world with, selling records was great, but I wanted to be closer to the artist.
Sure.
And getting into production and getting into booking and getting into the club business was much more close. And the great thing is I showed up, and that club opened around 1979, 1980, just in time for disco to be dying and punk rock to show up. And punk rock went from punk rock to alternative music pretty quickly. I liked punk. I liked the UK subs, and I liked the Sex Pistols, and I consider the Ramones a punk act, and I love those acts. And, the Ramones came through the club that we play, on a routine basis. So I love those guys. But, who also was showing up about that time were U2 and the Police and REM. And I'd say Depeche Mode, but I think they were a couple of years after that. But anyway, there was just a wide contingent, acts like Squeeze, that were coming over from the UK and coming down from New York, the Talking Heads. REM was just driving 50 miles up the road from Athens, Georgia. It was a great adventure. This club was open 7 nights a week, 365 nights a year, and we did 3 acts a night.
Wow.
So we were doing 1,000+ sets every single year, and we did that for a couple of years, and I learned a tremendous amount. I made a lot of friends. I started managing acts at that point. Managed a band called The Producers that had a couple of hits in the early 80s. They were kind of a poor man's Cars. Really, really good band, though. Excellent band. Still around to this day. Similar to The Shoes, somewhat similar to Cheap Trick. I did for a few minutes, probably a summer, I managed the Georgia Satellites that went on to have a mega hit called Keep Your Hands to Yourself. And while that was going on, these acts were moving from the club to the Fox Theater, which was the 4,000-seat. We had a 2,000-seat club called the Agora Ballroom on Peachtree in Atlanta, and right across the street was the Fox Theater, which was the 4,000-seat, beautiful turn-of-the-century theater that every major city seems to have one of.
Sure, yeah, the showcase, yeah.
But anyway, so when those bands were moving out of the club and moving across the street, a guy named Rich Floyd was the promoter, and he was a partner with the Agora, so I got a chance to be a promoter's rep and even in some cases co-promote. And when those acts moved from the Agora to the arena down the street, which at that point I believe was called the Omni, I got a chance to move that, and that was a relatively short period of time. I'm managing acts. Remember, I'd set up some stage steel and rolled some cases around in some Rolling Stone shows and got a chance to see that. I think I did the Cool Jazz Festival a couple of summers and rolled some cases around and got to know Sheila E., who I got to know later in my life when I worked with Prince. But anyway, that was kind of fun. It was different. Also, seeing people on stage that were the same age as I was amazing, because Sheila E. was probably a 16, 17-year-old when I was running around stage as a 16 or 17-year-old.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm managing, I'm co-promoting, I'm promoter repping, and then while this is all going on, one of the singers of the Producers decided he was going to go off on his own and do a solo deal, and this was a band that, by the way, we were on the road. That act probably played 340 nights a year.
Wow.
Remember, the club was open 365 nights a year, so I was used to working, I was used to
round the calendar
without a day off.
Yeah.
I was used to driving thousands of miles. We would drive in a van with a trailer from Los Angeles to New York, play a gig, drive to St. Louis, drive to Seattle, go to Miami, go to Nashville. We did lots of 1,000 and 2,000 mile drives nonstop. But, we were kids. We were teenagers. It was a great adventure. And about that time, probably heading into 83, I think it might have been, I got an offer to go work with Michael Jackson just in time for him to do Thriller. We had a mutual friend. Michael had an assistant, a young lady that I knew named Sherry Dubb, who was I guess you would call studio manager at Westlake Studios, where Michael had recorded. Well, the Producers had recorded there as well. Paul McCartney, was recording there about the same time. And long story short, the radio promotion guy that had worked with the producers was a guy like Charlie Miner. He would say he was probably more famous, but his name was Frank DeLeo, also known as Uncle Tukey.
Love that name.
I think Uncle Tukey might have been from that same collection of good old boys from Cleveland, Ohio.
Sure.
Anyway, he was a
Very
radio
likely.
promotion guy. If you want to go back and look at the books at radio promotion, you'll notice there were a decent amount of Italians involved. I'm married to an Italian. It's funny how that works. But anyway, Frank became Michael's manager just about the time that Michael was doing Thriller, and I'm not going to get way out in the weeds on why Frank, after he had spent a lot of time helping the producers have hits on the radio, he wanted to keep me a little closer at hand. You can read between the lines on that if you want. But anyway, I ended up getting a job with Michael Jackson just in time for Thriller to come out, and the adventure went from a van and a trailer to private jets and
The top of the
stars.
top.
I went from really probably the lower end of the middle to the very, very top in a very short period of time, and that lasted a little over a year. Prince was in the process of making Purple Rain, the movie. He was financing it out of his own pocket, or he was certainly borrowing money to finance it. And, Prince was an incredibly driven, he was an amazing artist, but he was also an incredibly driven human being. If I thought we were working hard, we were weaklings compared to how Prince worked. So anyway, he wanted to maximize his efforts. So one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to surround himself with as many Michael Jackson people as possible, of which I was one. And I'm not going to argue. There's different people that will tell you different stories. But one day I ended up on the phone with Prince. He was inviting us. They wanted me to reach out to other Michael Jackson people that could potentially come to work for him. And the funny thing is the average Michael Jackson, I was probably 20 at this point, and the average Michael Jackson employee during that era was probably a 37-year-old lifer. They'd been there for a long time. And, when I brought up Prince, and the first thing was, you mean that kid that wears women's underwear and high heel shoes and wears a trench coat? Yeah, we're not going. So I was the only one that went. And I ended up doing the same thing with Michael that I did same thing with Prince I ended up doing with Michael. I became the tour business manager, the tour accountant. I did the show settlements. But the interesting thing is that Michael Jackson in 1984, Prince in 1984, Purple Rain and Thriller. If you look at the tours today, if you look at a major tour like Taylor Swift, there's probably 500 or 600, 700 people on the road. When you get to the show, there's probably
easy 20 semis.
Yeah, there's thousands of people involved. In these individual shows. Well, there were Michael's tour probably had less than 100 people that were full-time touring, and the touring party was probably less than 25. And
Wow.
Prince, the same thing. It's probably 35 people on the road. Maybe 40 people on the road, and that means everyone wore a lot of hats. Everyone did a lot of jobs. If you were standing around and there were cases to be pushed, you pushed cases. If the caterer was stressing, get everybody fed, you'd run off and help that. So the reality is that on those tours, I got a disproportionate amount of excess. Michael was a little bit more reserved. There were two very distinct, in both those artist cases, there were two very distinctive people, both very hardworking, both pretty generous of spirit. Both very, very musical. Michael may be a tad more interested in bombastic performance and world domination, and Prince, I think, a little bit more interested in better playing.
Sure.
Prince might have been was definitely more musically astute. Michael was more performance astute, but they were both very, very similar in the way they kind of approached the work ethic and the way they expected people to work. They worked hard and they expected everyone around to work hard. So we were always doing something. Everybody was carrying, everybody was pushing. So that was an incredible 3.5 or 4 years of my life. I got a chance to be in giant tours and fly in private planes and go to awards and go to the White House and meet a lot of people. And at the same time, kind of just be, a minion 20 feet from stardom, So, but it was an interesting business because one thing I would say is, and I'm not, this is not a get off my yard, old guy thing, but there was an incredible amount of enthusiasm. As punk turned into new wave, and new wave kind of turned into alternative, and alternative kind of turned into commercial alternative. If you notice, the biggest music in the world, I mean, Michael Jackson was a mainstream pop artist, but Prince would have been considered a bit more alt.
Yeah.
More alternative, and the Police were an alternative band, and U2 were an alternative band, and it was a different world. It was a changing world. The music business that had probably shown up as a result of Elvis Presley in 1956 and Sam Phillips and RCA, that had kind of faded and then come back in a big way with, the Beatles in the early 60s. Well, that same business was pretty much in charge from the early 60s until the late 70s. They were even bringing you The Who and Alice Cooper and Led Zeppelin in the early 70s when music was going from theaters to arenas. But by 1980, that whole old guard, some of those people who had been in business, had been around for 25 years, were starting to fade out, and suddenly you started seeing music people that were in their 20s, music people that were coming from Tennessee and Athens, Georgia, and Milwaukee. I'm sure they always came from Midwestern and smaller southern towns. I'm sure they were always there. But I'm just saying that highly disproportionate amount of rural kids, and they were definitely kids, were starting to show up, and the music business kind of followed that. So there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. There was a tremendous amount of trying to do it a new and better way. And that business, probably from 1980, 1981, 82, it kind of held on until probably 2005, when the music industry that I'd been part of, that had showed up in the 50s and had resurfaced in the 80s, by around 2005, 2006, was pretty much fading.
Yeah, gone.
And technology was starting to show up. And the interesting thing that I got a chance to witness on both sides, because, I didn't know Steve Jobs, but I got to talk to him a few times. I managed a guy named Herbie Hancock with my partner Tony Milan.
Just a guy named Herbie Hancock.
Well, a legendary jazz pianist, a legend, but he was also, a wildly wide musical talent. Yes, he did funk, and yes, he did soul, and there's hip-hop people that'll say that, Rocket had as much a seat at the table for modern hip-hop as anything else. But anyway.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So that period of time, the 80s going into the 90s, Steve Jobs had been a founder of Apple and had left Apple and gone to Next, and then he came back to Apple and, did it right the second time. Well, the one thing that you could kind of tell is Steve Jobs had named his company Apple, and he told me in his own words, with the hopes of one day being sued by the Beatles. So he'd have a chance to actually be in a courtroom with John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
That's amazing.
That was his plan. He said, look, when you're starting off and you don't have any money, that's probably the best thing you got, because the idea of being able to go meet the Beatles was just not realistic.
Not going to happen, yeah.
So anyway, that's funny to see that that's how his mindset was, but at the same time, you realize that he loved music. He loved people that made music, so the whole point was Steve Jobs just wanted to get music on his devices. He would consider that to be, he wasn't trying to rule the world and make billions of dollars and be the biggest company in the world. He was just trying to do cool stuff. Well, just remember, though, that long story short, record companies knew nothing of technology. Technology companies knew nothing of the record business. And when Steve Jobs was going around to various label conglomerates, of which there were probably 5 major conglomerates at that point, they all told him, $1 billion. If you want to put our music on your platform, you got to give us $1 billion. Well, he didn't have $1 billion. And I guess you can probably look this up, and I'm sure there's historians that know much better. But along the lines, it appeared that one of those labels, I believe it might have been BMG conglomerate, gave him free access. We're just going to give you everything we have, and we'll split whatever profits there were. Well, the rest of the labels pretty much had to capitulate. Some held out longer than others, but at some point, about the time that Napster was stumbling around and starting to make, files, which, by the way, if you were ever getting those Napster files in the early days, you needed to be a technologist to be able to listen to music that way in the very early days. But anyway, a mistake was made. If you notice the music business that had showed up around Elvis Presley that we talked about, eventually, certainly in North America, and at least half the world, was an LP's business. It was an album business. You would buy a $10 album to be able to get a $1, to be able to get a single like Kiss.
Right.
And, that generated enough money for the record business, and it generated enough money for the artist. And I won't get out in the weeds about who was taking advantage of who, because I will tell you, once an artist became a superstar, they usually leveled the playing field pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But anyway, long story short, when they were making all that music available through iTunes in the early days, my hope would have been that they could have bundled. Maybe there was a 2-year window that from the time an LP came out until the time you could actually cherry pick singles, unless you were an artist that wanted to just sell singles. But what happened is that when eventually it became a singles business and it became $1 a song, it started making the music business, the album, the record business that I had told you about that we started off, it made it impossible to operate. They couldn't make it work on $1 a song. And eventually it just kind of collapsed into what we call streaming now. And streaming is really just radio. I mean, it's broadcast. It operates and functions the same way that radio always had. So artists rarely made very much money off of performance royalties for radio. It was rounding error for major artists. So here we are in a business that struggles to pay artists. And instead of paying them a fair amount, they just decided to pay them nothing. And
it was pretty insulting to watch that all play out.
I don't think it was done with evil intent. I think it happened. I think that the record business, the industry, was just slow to adapt. And I think that technologists who just want to see their technology work, that was the number one thing, basically just kind of shoved music aside, and it's devalued it. Now, is it permanent? I don't know. It's
that's a good question. Who are the bands that you see, or who are the musical acts that you see that make you think that it's not dead?
Well, I'll go ahead and do a shameless self-promote. The reason I got back into the music business as a manager because of a Costa Rican rock band called the Saint Cecilia. They have 4 songs on Spotify. They've been out for about a year. Tom Rothrock, a legendary record producer, produced the 4 songs, but they're a rock band. They're Costa Rican. They're French. They all surf. They all grew up with Led Zeppelin records and U2 records and Elvis Presley records and Chuck Berry records and
these guys.
These guys right here.
Brilliant.
And they're a bona fide rock band. But listen, when you want to get into truly a bona fide rock band, it's like talking about hot rods and Harley Davidsons. These are this is antique technology. Hot rods, Harley Davidson.
Oh my God, that's such a great way to describe it.
They're not modern, it's retro stuff.
Yeah, no, it is, for sure.
Talk about rock for the sake of rock, and you have a band like Greta Van Fleet, that's channeling Led Zeppelin. That's kind of antique music. It's okay. But I mean, if you remember everything that, kind of got us into this in the very first place, it certainly wasn't antique. So it's an interesting, I don't know what the hybrid is. I know that I like the fact that I'm seeing guitars show up again.
Yeah, like actual music. Instruments. Yeah.
But I also, I'm okay with, with digital technology. Tomita was an electronic artist when I was a kid that I thought was fantastic. I like it all. As long as it's inspired and as long as it's got some level of authenticity and human connection, whether it's made, whether the instrument is a computer or a guitar. If it's good, it's good. But what's happened, I mean, we're in a world right now that when, suddenly, the record business people talked about when I was a kid was a bank. But, there was more to it than that, because the record business, you had people who did artist development, those labels, and they were not only spending money doing recordings. And look, there was always a top 40 commercial alternative piece of the music business that brought you people like Barbra Streisand.
Right.
That part of the pop music business was always, standing on its own. It was always successful. Glenn Campbell, amazing artist, Burt Bacharach, Anyway, that part of the music business was there and funding, and I think that gave them a chance to take chances on things like Frank Zappa and, and even groups like REM. So there was a certain part of the music business that was on the edge, that was developing things they considered to be unique, and I think, created some kind of spirituality in music. And funny thing was, when I was working with Michael Jackson, and I'll gossip a little bit about this because this stuff is available in books, but you had Michael Jackson making music, and you had him dancing 14, 15, 16 hours a day and working on his vocals and and writing songs. And Michael Jackson was very, very concerned and worried about the recorded quality of his music and the performance and the dancing and the sound and lights and whatever video was attached to it. There wasn't video broadcast at that point, but he was embracing everything about the art and the music with hopes that he was doing good enough music that the world would want to beat a path to his door. I remember sitting in an office one day. It wasn't an office, it would have been a hotel room, but Frank DeLeo, as I told you, Michael Jackson's manager, and a few other people were sitting in a meeting. We were talking about tour business, and Jermaine Jackson, one of Michael's younger brothers, came in, who had a single out at that point called Dynamite. It had been out for about 6 months. It was a freestanding single. I'm sure it was attached to an album, but that's all he was known for. I mean, he was Jermaine Jackson, but anyway, they performed Dynamite as part of that show, that tour. The Thriller tour was actually known as the Victory Tour, that included all 5 of the brothers.
Interesting.
The last time they ever toured together, it was Michael pretty much saying goodbye to the family business.
Yeah.
That tour was driven by Thriller. The brothers, they did a great job. They played their hits. Really pretty amazing. But anyway, the interesting thing I saw was that Jermaine Jackson came in to Frank DeLeo saying he needed a certain amount of money to pay for a PR person. And Frank said, well, Jermaine, we've got PR. You're getting PR every day. You're in every newspaper in every town you go into. You're on the news all the time. What more PR do you need? He said, yeah, but the PR is mostly for Michael, and it's mostly for this tour, and I'm an artist. And Frank said, everyone knows you're an artist, but what are you going to talk about? That you're on the Jackson's Victory Tour, that you had a single 6 months ago? And he was frustrated because he believed that he needed more attention. He believed he needed more press. And I remember thinking, and I remember Frank saying, but you have nothing to promote. You have no story. There's not anything to, and it's not, he goes, I'm not being, I'll be happy to give you the money, Jermaine, but there's nothing personal here, but you don't have anything, there's no newsworthy things that we're going to talk about, so a PR person's just going to take your money. And I remember thinking that, I didn't have really an opinion one way or another, but it kind of got my attention. And now fast forward, we're in a world where you have people who, I'm not saying that everyone from Taylor Swift to Tom Cruise is Jermaine Jackson, but we are in a world that people are desperately worried about not having enough attention and having to get PR every single day. And it's just, is it natural? No. The whole point is being famous for the sake of being famous. It's limited. Being famous for doing some kind of creative art is different. And I'm not sitting here throwing mud on influencers or anything else like that, but I'm just saying we're in a strange world where it's very difficult to make money recording music and making music. Yeah. And everything drives you to wanting to become, it's a narcissistic pursuit to try to get onto social media every day, multiple hours a day. Yeah. It's for most, it's a dead-end street. And just imagine, a guy like Prince used to spend 18 hours a day writing music and, 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day perfecting and performing it. And now you need to spend 18 hours a day working on social media, and music and performance takes a back seat. That's a dead-end street, too.
Well, it's funny because all of the people that I know that make independent music, just, whether they're pursuing it as a career or just releasing it for fun, every one of them will say this: I hate dealing with the social media, but I have to. Yeah. And that's, a sign of the times. That's where we're at. It's the social media is the new business card. It's effectively the new website. And, if you're not posting consistently, you're just going to get lost in the fog, for sure.
Well, yeah, listen, and this is not forever. This is not the end. at the beginning.
Because
No. I mean, things do change, and social media is relatively new. 10 years from now, it's not going to have the same impact it has today.
yeah,
Everyone points, when people look at Horizon and it has a large logo called AI attached to it. And you can talk to 100 people about what AI is, and there'll be 95 different opinions. There are people who see it as a new god. There are people who see it's going to cause nothing but problems. There are people who see it, but the truth is, it's all it is computer programming. It's hyper advanced programming, but computers aren't programming themselves quite yet, and we don't have pro creating computers, and we don't have pro creating software at this point. Hey, maybe that changes. But if you see the greatest technology companies in the world, if you try to have a conversation you have a problem with tech support, see how that goes.
yeah, sure.
Technology was super advanced, it would probably work a lot better than it does. But anyway. The interesting thing I'll say that I don't think shows up in a lot of surveys and conversations when we talk about social media, and we talk about analog recordings, and we talk about a world pre-social media, we talk about a world pre-digital distribution. I mean, one thing I'll tell you as a young manager, what used to keep me awake at night was if you had an act that was starting to make some noise, you needed 50,000 copies of your LP to be at least 2 copies in 25,000 record stores that you needed coverage in.
Yeah.
Well, that took a lot of oomph. And if your records didn't sell, they had to pay to get them back and destroy them.
Yikes.
Not everything would get cut out. If you didn't have a hit, they weren't going to bother cutting out. They were going to throw it into landfill. So the long and the short of it is, for young artists, digital distribution is a dream. It means your music's available to every single person on the planet who's got a computer. But it's also created a saturation problem. I do think, and look, I'm not a futurist, but you have to imagine of the 200,000 or 300,000 or 400,000 people a day that are uploading music. I think that the Spotify numbers are 250,000 a day uploads.
Wow,
that's not sustainable.
Yeah, of course not.
Hard drive after server after server. That stuff still costs money. Just storing that stuff still costs money. It still takes electricity. So the fact is that that's not going to be unlimited forever. And the other thing is, there's a lot of people who are hoping. Some people are uploading stuff for shits and giggles. Some are uploading because they'd like to have a career. But we all know that probably 95% of the music I've come across in my life was pretty good.
Yeah.
Not terrible. Not, the funny thing is only about 5% of the music I've ever come across in my life was really great. And about 5% of the music I came across in my life was really terrible. The other 90% was just fine. I have to believe that the lion's share of those 250,000 songs that are being uploaded today are probably passable. I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of that's going to disappear. I think when people start realizing just how impossible it actually is, and how hard the work is, and how time consuming it is, the people who seem to be on the cutting edge right now, look, if you're a magnificently talented person and your music's very unique and it's very hooky, you can have a hit. You can have hits. You can have a career that resembles careers that have been happening for 50, 60 years. It's those artists that aren't the top 1% that are struggling. I mean, if a Prince showed up today, I'm sure he would figure it out. If a Tom Petty showed up today, I'm sure they are figuring it out. But I think a lot of the clutter and a lot of the confusion and a lot of the saturation will just fall by the wayside. And I think that might free it up a little bit more. And look, this is, the old days and the new days are all pretty much the same. I'm having as much fun in music today than I ever did. But once upon a time, there was usually an island of people in any town you could get to, over 5,000, that were probably part of your tribe, and you probably had a phone number for them. Eventually you had an email address for them. But when you were coming to town, you had friends, and they would spread the word. And you could basically find a way to start finding couches to sleep on and clubs to play, and it was a little easier than more tribal. Well, today there's probably thousands of acts doing that as opposed to being hundreds back there. And I know that there's people out there on the road earning a living. I see them pop up. I see them in truck stops. I see their name pop up on posters as, one of the 400 acts that plays Coachella. The interesting thing, though, is that what seems to be missing, if you really want to get down to it, is when I was a kid and first showing up, there were scenes. There was an Athens music scene, and there was certainly a scene in New York, and there was certainly a scene in Minneapolis, and there was a scene in Seattle, but there was also in San Francisco, and every town. Denver had one, Chicago had one, Birmingham, Alabama had one. And those scenes usually involved venues, and they involve fashion, and they involved in art, and they involve people who were pretty tribal. Even if you looked at the Athens music scene, a lot of the musical artists there were very similar. B-52s and REM and Love Tractor and Pylon, personality-wise, dress-wise, culture-wise, politically.
The whole aesthetic, yeah.
But when you went to Minneapolis, you had Prince, and you had the Time, but you also had Information Society, and you had the Replacements. The funny thing is, those guys all went to the same high schools. But their music was
drastically
not necessarily similar, but they were still friends. They all went to each other's shows. So not every scene was exactly the same. The scene in New York was totally different, in 1966, between 76 and then 86. But, that art scene, that fashion scene, that tribal scene, that cultural thing generally had several thousand people a night, at least on weekends, going out and doing things with other people. And that's in short supply. When I'm driving up, the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood today, when I first got here in probably 1980 or so, there were thousands of people in the Sunset Strip. Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. Mondays were pretty slow. And that went on until probably the early 2000s. It went from hair band. There was punk in there, and there were hair bands in there, and it was a completely different, different group of people. And I know in the 60s, if you look at, what happened up in Laurel Canyon, those people were on the same part of the Sunset Strip. But if you drive through West Hollywood, any of those legendary clubs, they're still there. The Whiskey's still there. The Roxy's still there. But it's a ghost town.
Not jumping like it was.
You don't see. Listen, on a Friday or Saturday night, you don't see. If you see 5 people walking down the street, it'd be surprising.
Wow.
So I think that's part of what's missing. And does that change? I don't know. I hope so.
Well, I think
can to change it.
The scenes evolve and towns change and scenes grow and falter, and you're interesting because you're around 2 of the biggest, most recent music scene rushes, Athens and L.A. Like L.A. in the 90s, Athens in the 80s. Did it feel like something special was going on there when you were there, and now that you've had some time?
Yes, there was a tremendous amount of hope and enthusiasm. I mean, there were people who were very, very excited, but you could see it. And touring during that time, things were still very, very much new. And the interesting thing is that it's funny, but Athens, people were just really happy to be heard.
Yeah.
In Los Angeles, when I got here, people were just really happy to make some money. So it was always just different. Now, everyone, listen, you always had the same people doing the same stuff. But the funny thing is the out-of-towners were treated with much more respect than the locals. Where if you went to Minneapolis or you went to Athens, Georgia, or you went to Birmingham, England, for instance, the locals were king. So it's funny, Michael Stipe was king of Athens, but he was also king of Los Angeles. More so than the guys from X,
Yeah.
So, but anyway, the main thing today, if you look at real estate's very expensive, so people can't just sit around and lose, and sit on a club waiting for it to become a PF Chang's or something. I mean, today things happen very quickly. So, the idea of a 300 or 400 or 500 seat club, just sitting around vacant, 30 or 40 nights a year, 50 nights a year is just not sustainable. But, if you go to places like Scandinavia and in smaller European countries, they've always had multi-purpose. They would take a cafeteria and turn it into a punk rock club.
Yeah.
There'd be, and there was a great club in Stockholm that was a dinner theater and a dancing club that at 11 o'clock they move all the tables out of the world and they roll in a punk rock band, and people in ball gowns were leaving just as the punks were coming in. I always got a huge kick out of that. But
you gotta love that, yeah.
Yeah, but look, in what I experienced in the 80s, what I experienced in the 90s, what I even experienced going into the 2000s, there was youth attached to it, and there was a lot of hope, and it beat the hell out of just basically going to the movies, although there was nothing wrong with that. But today there's a tremendous amount of competition for your time. Hey, even I fall prey to it. I even spend a huge amount of time consuming digital information.
Sure.
A lot of it
we can't escape from it.
Yeah.
We're stuck in this prison of screens, whether we like it or not. But
yeah,
I'm kind of the same mind. Like, it's a gift and a curse. Yes, we have the ability to find people making music in Ethiopia right now, but then it's like everyone is everywhere is putting stuff out there or vying for your attention, and we're not even bringing it like advertisers or corporations into the mix. We're just saying people who are uploading content on their own.
Well, one thing that's happened in the digital world is when something starts happening, an act can go from absolute 0 to 100 in weeks, and the fact is that suddenly a bunch of people with money show up.
Yeah.
You're a 16-year-old hip hop artist that literally had never played a show and have been uploading, 5 or 6 songs a week for 3 years, and all of a sudden one of your things hits and, a few 100 million people pay attention to it. And literally, before your parents even know what's going on, you got guys knocking on your door with checkbooks.
Yeah, right.
Suddenly offering some 17-year-old kid who's never even held a job and never had more than $100 in his bank account, and suddenly you're offering him $7 million. That creates a lot of pop smokes. That creates a lot of kids who basically kind of disappear in their own shadow. Not everyone. But the reality is, the one thing that's just crazy is success gets so bombarded by attention and money today that it's very, very difficult for things to kind of, people overuse the word organic, and I do as well. But it's very difficult. If REM had been showered with money when Radio Free, Europe, their first indie single had come out, there's a very good chance that their 2 biggest albums that happened literally, I think, 8 and 10 years into their career never would have happened. And we'd be having a completely different conversation about them as we would. So, things do take time to develop. People do have to mature and learn what they're doing. And when suddenly everything is about business, because that's the hardest part about this whole thing when we talk about social media. I mean, social media is a business, but it's a business that belongs to the company that owns the social media platform, and we're working full time for them.
Yep.
Try to be able to get as much attention as possible, and everything's about content. Once upon a time, people talked about content being king, but what they meant was good content was king. They left that part out, but now it's just. I think Tom Waits was saying there's a big difference between knowledge and information, and we have a tremendous amount of information out there. But the interesting thing is, if you look, and it doesn't matter what side of the, what your political stance is, whether you're going to vote for Donald Trump or whether you're going to vote for Kamala Harris, the reality is that shit is getting so saturated. I mean, even Trump's getting tired of hearing himself, and I never thought that I would live to see. You can even tell that his heart's not into it. And I'll tell you something, that guy was spending 14, 16 hours a day, on television, on your computer, on your radio. For 4 years, I'd never seen anything like it. And I thought, there's no way this guy comes back to that same level. And, he came back with the same kind of rambunctiousness and the same absolute just insane need for attention. But, even he's getting worn out. Even you can see he's not into it anymore. I mean, everyone's just a little bit fucking burnt out. I have no idea what happens in this November election, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the idea of politicians being in your face 10, 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week will probably go by the wayside far sooner than later.
Yeah, I think everyone across the country is feeling that in their own very special way. And I think, especially there's this documentary that I reference all the time. It's called We Live in Public. It was about one of the guys who was one of the big players in the .com boom. And basically he spent the bulk of his money on these very large scale social experiments where he bought a building in New York and let 100 people live in it and let them do drugs and shoot guns, and you could get interrogated, and it was just like lawlessness for 100 days. But he filmed everything, and the catch was, you can live here for free, you can stay here for free, do whatever you want, but I'm going to film it and I'm going to own it. Anyways, the point I'm saying is that this was a guy who basically called Facebook, Instagram 10, 15 years before it happened, and he said, this social media, the idea of living in public, that's going to become a thing. Everyone's going to love it. We're going to flock to it. And then it's going to turn on you because you'll have sacrificed all of your sense of self identity, and you're instead worried about like the projection's identity, the projection of yourself's identity, as opposed to like, am I okay? Am I being a reasonable human being? But I mean, we're there. The documentary came out in like 2008, and again, he was saying all this shit in the early 90s, but we're absolutely there.
Well, there's no way, because things change and platforms change, and that changes, the ingredients in the pie. So you'll never know exactly what flavor you're going to get. But an interesting thing happened to me, and I want to say it was maybe somewhere in the last 8 to 16 months. I was sitting in a restaurant, and there was no one else there, and I was just totally at peace. I wasn't stressing about anything. I wasn't thinking about anything. I wasn't putting my mind to useful behavior. I was just at peace. And one of the guys that worked at the restaurant walked up and said, "You seem like a very interesting person." And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" He said, "Well, you're just kind of sitting there glowing, and you just don't see a lot of people do that." And it was uncomfortable at first, and I didn't know really what to do with that information. But it put a little push pin in that exact experience, because what it did is it really gave me a chance to actually identify with me feeling really good and me feeling really whole. And that doesn't happen very much. When I look back in my past, you know what? Listen, I had incredible memories. I had incredible swashbuckling memories that involved people going into pools and people falling off of buildings, and drugs and alcohol and things catching on fire and cops coming and complete chaos. I had a lot of fun with that stuff. And I also got a lot of injuries, and I had a lot of apologizing to do. But the reality is, I had as much fun in life as any human being could have. But joy is a different thing. And joy is kind of limited, in your youth, into your old age. And when you look at it right now, so much time is eaten up, and we feel so obligated to be using all of our time and our brain at all times that it's very, very difficult to just sit down and feel peace and joy. And technologists and Meta and Google and Apple and Microsoft and all the companies that are vying for your time, there's not some mastermind sitting there trying to completely destroy man and womankind. They're just basically trying to get their tech to do the best it possibly can. They want everything to work the way it's programmed. They want to be able to maximize everything they do. But the problem is, they're all doing that in unison, and they're all fighting with each other. And they actually are. There is a sinister side of this, because there are addictive components that are basically being programmed,
exploited,
to try to get and keep your attention. And, you wonder where that's going to all end. Because all this stuff, as you keep sucking more and more people's attention, and you keep sucking more and more of their enthusiasm, and you keep shortening the amount of time they can have joy. Joy is basically something that helps you recharge your batteries, the energy that you go forward with. And what happens when you basically just suck all that, you're going to suck all the productivity out of people. Then all of a sudden you're going to let AI do it, and then you're going to go ahead and let machines do it. Well, then I hope machines have bank accounts and are able to figure out a way to make money, and let this capitalism become self-fulfilling as well. Let that become a perpetual motion machine. Because the reality is, as you continue, you're killing the people that you're sucking the life out of, and the enthusiasm out of the people you're making money off of. That's not sustainable.
Not a sustainable model at all.
And I don't think there's any single person sitting in those companies just sitting around worried about what the damage they're doing to enthusiasm. I mean, music and that kind of stuff, the reason I consider, I continue to stay connected to it is, it also generates joy. It generates enthusiasm. I mean, what I see truly in the world right now is a massive shortness. There's a short supply of joy and enthusiasm out there. And those are two extremely important energy builders.
Yeah, no, I could not agree. I think I probably talked about this with every guest I've had on the past year, is like just the general sense of hopelessness that we're seeing across so many different domains. It's inspiring and terrifying. Like when I look at some of the younger generations, some of their views of the world are some of the most hopeless shit I've ever heard. But then I'm also like super excited about the younger generations because some of the things they care about is some of the coolest shit I've ever heard. And it's like as a kid, they're already caring. Like maybe it's a shift from the more materialistic world that we grew up in, and a revert back to the simple things that bring us joy and recharge whatever it is that our life force is. But
hey, look, it's anyone's guess. I'm a hopeful person. The reality is I still have a tremendous amount of hope. The interesting thing that I'll say that's changed in my life as I've gone from young man to old man is, and as I said, when I was 10, I wasn't necessarily a social creature. At some point, I flipped the switch, and I'm definitely a gregarious, so I'm a communicator, and I'm definitely a social creature now, which means if you're stuck with me in a restaurant or an airport lounge or a plane, I do okay. If you really want to be left alone, I'll leave you alone. But if you give me just a crack of light, I'm going in. We're going to have a conversation. You know what I'm trying to say? And I will say that on average, it's more difficult to strike up a conversation with a stranger today than it ever has been. But, occasionally you come across someone else that's a communicator. When that happens, occasionally a room full of people will witness that exchange. And sometimes a few more people will engage. I've had people that I've kind of worn out at the very end go, thank you for that. You scared the shit out of me at first, or I just didn't really want
I didn't think I was going to enjoy that. But
the reality is that I'm not telling anyone how they have to live, but I mean, you do have to kind of go out of your way to communicate. We are pack animals.
Sure.
We are. But that's part of
the deal down here.
That's part of our identity, and the reality is we're actually being taken from each other, and we're being taught to leave each other alone, and we're being taught to basically turn into our own little capsule, of creativity and consumerism and everything else. And the fact is, I do think that we should figure out a way. I think it's important for us to go out and touch nature every once in a while, but please don't do it in mass. You don't want 60 million people going to Walden Pond at the same time, but you know what I'm saying.
Definitely not.
The same token is, don't be afraid to communicate. Don't be afraid to talk to each other, And I will say that it's funny because when you go into, major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles and New York are different than cities like Austin, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte. It's a little less stressful in some of these smaller communities. And I think that there are people definitely exiting. And I think you'll see a lot more people. And the one interesting thing about technology is that, some of the things I have hope for is I got a lot of friends that came from racing and even a few friends that came from motorsport that are out there trying to figure out a way to build, $60,000 carbon fiber self-sustaining homes. That anyone would want to live in, that two people can coexist in. But, part of that whole thing is not so much getting off the grid because we're survivalist and we need all the food and we're going to basically kill each other, when the zombie apocalypse happens. But when you start talking about this kind of thing where, the need for power that's going to just gargantuan need for power that's going to basically take to drive AI. There's going to be some balance because there's going to be no way to power all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then when we start grabbing, obviously the most green power on the planet is nuclear. But I was raised at a time that's the most evil power in the world. Because what happens is if you have people are prone for accident, and when you have a nuclear accident, you can kill millions of people, and you can completely destroy a huge piece of land as a result of it. So Once they kind of figure that part out, then who knows about power. But the thing I'm talking about is that, there's a lot of really beautiful places in the United States, a lot of beautiful places in Canada, a lot of beautiful places in Germany and France and Brazil and Japan. And there's a lot of available land, private or otherwise, is where you start building more affordable housing and you start moving some people out of these major cities. Well, you need ways to generate power because we're still going to need entertainment. We're still going to need communication. So solar will have to become more powerful. Wind will have to become more powerful. But the other thing that's interesting is these friends of mine that are building carbon fiber houses that they want to eventually sell for $50,000. Their whole thing is that solar, battery, and water reclamation and actually individual water purification becomes super, super important. And those kinds of things can actually make life a lot more livable, a lot more affordable. Technology will help us grow. Will help us basically grow produce, and be able to eat, maybe stop eating so many animals. But, all I'm getting down to is that for every single bit of dour hopelessness the world we're in right now generates, there's probably equal amounts of hope that can be generated by it.
Easy, yeah.
And some of these things are biggest fears. I mean, dystopian society. Well, you know what? Depends on where you are, because for some people, there are slums in ghetto areas of the world that have been dystopian. I mean, literally for 75 years.
Yeah, for a long time now.
So it really depends on where you are. Downtown dystopian Beverly Hills, still a few years away, but could happen. And the other thing is, what happens? How do we react to that? Do we sit in it and give up, or do we change it?
Yeah, I've definitely always been of that mind. Like sometimes things have to get really bad before it's going to get better. So it's not that we want things to get bad, but we just understand that until enough people recognize this is a problem we have to deal with right now. That's what.
Well, listen, hopelessness, we've all experienced it. It doesn't last with me as long as it lasts with some people. I'm not prone towards depression, but I know what it is. You understand? And I mean, I'm not saying it's a simple thing. And there's certainly, as we get less and less connected, there's more and more chances for us to be lonely, and lonely can definitely lead to hopelessness as well. But the truth is just getting out, finding fresh air if you can possibly find it, finding nature if you can possibly find it, and just walking around in it. And I'm not a hippie by any stretch of the imagination. I'm definitely a city kid. You know what I'm saying? But I find there's a tremendous amount of value in that.
Nature's important.
And I think that the same thing. I was going back to the whole music point. The interesting thing is I used to work with a guy named Richard Thompson. You may or may not have heard of him, a guitar player, English. You should look him up. He had a band called Fairport Convention in the 60s. And he was the first person, when people talk about Bob Dylan was the guy that brought the electric guitar to folk. Richard Thompson probably was. But anyway, an extremely good guitarist, a very good singer, a good folk artist. I once asked Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, why is it that the folk music Led Zeppelin does is more appealing to me than the folk music the Carter family does? He said, well, first of all, you kind of grew up on a rock diet, but the other thing is there's a certain amount of power and control that goes with Led Zeppelin's folk music, which was basically us channeling Richard Thompson. And Richard Thompson's kind of a verbose, powerful acoustic guitarist and whatever. But the reality is this guy is a king of the cults. There's been times in his life that he's sold for maybe 500,000 records. Never recouped. Never made any money off his record sales because the cost of, the major music business was too high.
Yeah.
So he was always one of those guys that sold a lot of records but didn't make any money off them. He had to live off touring. Well, the interesting thing now, and I'm not blowing his cover because I don't really know his numbers, but he's got at least a couple of 100,000 fans that are really motivated, that really buy his music. They buy it in download, they buy it in CD, they buy it in vinyl. But an artist like Richard Thompson, who was a king of the cults guy, is making probably more money today than he ever did in his entire life. Off a fan base of a couple 100,000. And look, a couple 100,000 is exactly 199,000 more than 1,000. Yeah. It's hard to get 1,000 fans. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, for
what
sure.
I'm saying is that, technology allows you to lower the bar. And if you know how to do this, you can earn a living much earlier. You can earn a meaningful living. And the whole point is that we are in a world where suddenly, if you're not, the thing about the internet and the thing about digital technology and the thing about social media is it puts everything everything's an international competition. The second you put out a song, you're no longer putting out a song in Atlanta or Denver or Des Moines. You're now putting out a song in the world. You're competing equally with Dua Lipa and Cardi B and Taylor Swift and the Foo Fighters, as far as that business goes. And everybody suddenly feels like, not everybody, but there's a lot of people that suddenly feel like in order to have a meaningful, successful career, you need to win Grammys and make millions of dollars. And
you really don't.
I know a lot of Grammy winners, and I know a lot of people who've made a lot more than millions of dollars who aren't necessarily happy or satisfied with their careers. And I know some very, very, very happy people. The funny thing is, I don't really know the REM guys that well. I know some of them, but I think they're all happier today than they ever were in the height
at the peak.
Career.
Yeah.
I mean, and the whole funny thing is, look, they're not even, some of them are making music, some of them aren't making music at all, but they all seem to be much more satisfied. They're happy with the career they had. So you're looking at an act that, most people thought were pretty spiritually sound people, pretty fair-minded people, but they had a huge career, and, in the absence of their career, they're happier than they ever were.
That's real success right there.
Yeah. And I think that's the whole thing. I mean, just trying to, the simple thing. I mean, go back to John Lennon, as he once said, all we were trying to do was earn a living. All we were trying to do was not have a day job. None of us were sitting around trying to become the most successful artist on the planet. And if you notice, when we became very successful, we started doing all kinds of things to screw it up. The funny thing is, Paul wasn't quite as much a saboteur as the rest of us were. And that probably kind of balanced it out. But, none of us, were sitting around trying to figure out a way to be the biggest act in the world, because not only did a lot of responsibility come with that, but a lot of boredom came with that. And a lot of expectation and mouths to feed came with that. So, I think that there's a tremendous amount, maybe it's just what I see, of people just trying to figure out a way to be superstars, trying to be major stars, instead of just trying to put out interesting, meaningful music. And I think that I'm sure there's more opportunities to earn a living off of music today than there ever have been. Figuring that out, I don't know what that necessarily means. It's a little bit different for everyone.
Well, and that's part of the journey, right? That should be part of the journey, is figuring out how you express yourself the best, how you interact with social media the best, and do the things that allow you to maximize your ability to release content, engage with your audience. I don't know. Those things to me, just
to finish off, so it's all kind of attached. I went on after doing that stuff. I ended up, managing, as I said, Herbie Hancock and the Fine Young Cannibals, and doing some work with Massive Attack, and doing a decent amount of film and TV music, and and having that splinter off into other things, and doing consultancy work, and doing consulting for major acts on why their merchandise wasn't selling. And the reality is, all I was doing was, I would just look at the Rolling Stones and go, would I buy that shirt? So the only thing that I ever recommended is, here's a collection of merchandise that I would buy. You know what I'm trying to say? And then suddenly their merch numbers went through the roof. So I knew something about good merchandise design that had been forgotten, because suddenly the people who are doing the merchandise design are also the same people that print the shirts, and they're going to make it easy for themselves, not more difficult.
Of course.
For themselves.
Yeah,
so
of course.
That's one bit. The other thing I was going to say is that those the tools that you need for success, all of them, if you're willing to do the work and work some day jobs, are available to you. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So besides all that stuff, I had a great adventure of being able to run into lots of people. And sometimes, as a result of the people you work with, you get a chance to meet other people. You get a chance to hang. You're welcomed into people's living rooms you wouldn't normally be. Well, we had a neighbor, and Frank Zappa. I think you were a fan of Zappa's, right?
Sure, yeah.
And,
Zappa.
Frank wasn't a guy that was really available to the neighborhood. He wasn't out in the street, watering his yard or whatever. But, his kids were friends of some people who work with us. And, I think they even came to our house a few times. But there were a couple of times, for different reasons, that I ended up having a chance to engage shortly, Because, Frank was, I wouldn't say a man of few words, but he wasn't a guy that was just going to sit in the street and shoot the shit. He wasn't a small talker. But a couple of times I had a chance to engage him with various reasons, different reasons. I mean, for different reasons. And at one point, he just kind of brought up, he said, in the early part of our career, we were already being discussed as countercultural heroes around the world, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And you come to Los Angeles and you go to the Whiskey A Go-Go and see us play in front of 5 people. There's famous photographs of us in the 60s when we were big fucking stars that were playing for nobody at the Whiskey. So we were making no money.
Yeah.
But he said, the interesting thing was that, I did a lot of clowny, wacky, fart sounds, let's just face it, stupid music. And I did it literally, overtly to separate myself from everyone else on purpose. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't trying to be unique for the sake of being unique. I was literally just pushing the envelope because I knew I wasn't going to fit in with the way I looked and the way I played and my tastes and the sound of my voice. I wasn't going to be a Beatle, and I wasn't going to be a Buffalo Springfield, and I wasn't going to be a Neil Young. It wasn't in the cards for me. So I intentionally went off and did wacky stuff. And you know what? Some people gravitated towards some of that wacky stuff. And then all of a sudden, you got to kind of keep that going. But as you're keeping it going, you have to kind of make it palatable and interesting for you. So it became basically kind of a compromise. And then all of a sudden, what it did is it pushed me off into an area that I never would have gotten to if I had just done what I thought I was supposed to do for success. So, the funny thing is that I can't speak for anyone else, but that's an example that if you really work hard and you stay focused and you keep adjusting, you can't fail.
Yeah.
Because I was doing stupid shit that had no possibilities of being commercial, and you know what? It led to something. And the truth is, you just have to, that's the whole point. You're probably better off doing something completely wacky, out of control,
Absolutely.
and reeling that into something else than coming at it from the other side. Because what happens, I think, today is people look and go, okay, this is the framework that's out there. I can find everything online, so I'm going to sit within these parameters. And guess what? You're guaranteed of having no success. If your building blocks are just taking a variety of things that are succeeding and trying to slam them together, as I've already told you, about 90% of the music out there is pretty good. Yeah. It's the truth. And the reason I can say this, James, is, my attitude when I was a young manager, a middle-aged manager, got out of management and were motorsport. But the funny thing is I'm still working in an office. I'm partners with Tony Dimitriadis, who's Tom Petty's the Heartbreakers manager and is also partially Fleetwood Mac's manager, etc. You still walk into those offices and there's piles of Jiffy Packs as recently as 15 years ago. And in those Jiffy Packs, there used to be, at one point there were LPs and then there were cassettes and there were CDs and even people would send thumb drives out, believe it or not. Well, there's still people sending CDs out, believe it or not. But my attitude is if someone could get it together to record some music and then get that music put onto some medium, and then put a cover on it, then get it pressed up, and then find my address or Tony Dimitriadis' address and get it together to mail it to them along with a letter trying to get them to be heard. My obligation is I'm going to listen to this stuff. I mean, it's the least I can do. So I was listening to demos that came to me and demos that came to Lindsey Buckingham and demos that came to Tom Petty and demos that came to Tony Dimitriadis, that stuff that was going to get either returned or thrown into a dumpster. I'm listening to. So I'm listening to thousands and thousands of demos. And as someone, I can guarantee that I've listened to 100,000, demoed songs that came to me with people I didn't know at all. I can say, with clear conscience, 90% of it was pretty good. It wasn't always, rarely my cup of tea, but it was rarely bad.
Yeah.
I think you have to be somewhat convoluted to really suck and to get it together to go through that entire process. You know what I'm saying? And send it to someone. I won't say you have to be mentally ill, but the 5% of the stuff that I got that was really terrible, if I ever talked to those people on the phone, I would say that pretty much 100% of the time they were whack jobs.
Yeah, that tracks. Yeah.
I mean, it was just like opera singers that couldn't carry a tune. I mean, so 5% of the music was just terrible. Just not good. I mean, unbelievably bad, almost to the point of being interesting. You know what I'm saying? And 5% of it was really great. And of the 5%, usually one of the 5% was actually pretty fucking special. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But 90% of it was pretty good. So that's what you're generally going to get. And pretty good's not going to cut it.
Well, I love that. I love that approach, and I love that way of looking at it. And I would agree. Like, I've always been of the mindset, and all the bands that I really love are bands that just really did their own thing. And maybe it was a slow start for them, but because they did their own thing and they just kept doing it, they stood out. All the other trendy bands at that time came and went, but they're still around. They made music that was timeless because they weren't, catering to a specific genre. I think those are definitely major words of advice right there.
And it's interesting too when you think about, like, you take the Foo Fighters for example. I mean, Dave Grohl, excellent drummer, no question. I like Nirvana. I had their albums, I listened to them, but it wasn't until I saw Dave Grohl playing drums with Queens of the Stone Age that I realized he was an excellent drummer.
Yeah.
So this guy was coming from from a valid place. And the whole thing was he sat behind one of the greatest frontmen of all time for a relatively short period of time. But truth be told, he wasn't starting from scratch.
Yeah.
When the Foo Fighters came along. But the interesting thing was that you look at him, the Foo Fighters are excellent showmen, very bombastic, very exciting rock show. But, if Dave Grohl, if that had been his first band, we wouldn't be talking about the Foo Fighters right now. I'm not saying they wouldn't have had some level of success, but they certainly wouldn't be the stadium act. And what that actually allowed them was a platform of notoriety, a certain level of financial freedom and comfort to be able to go out and truly play the hits and do things that get everyone's attention and also do things that are meaningful to them. But the interesting thing is Don and I went to a stadium show at SoFi Stadium here in Los Angeles a few weeks ago and saw Kenny Chesney and Zac Brown Band. I'm sure that I've seen Kenny Chesney and I'm sure I've seen Zac Brown Band at award shows and all. I've never seen them in concert, but I know they're valid artists. But, in the stadium setting, they were very exciting. Both of them were far more rock than country, entertaining that stadium full of people. But, Zac Brown did Sabotage, backed up by Bohemian Rhapsody, and did very, very credible versions of both of those songs to take the audience to a place that they never could have gotten the audience to with just their music.
Yeah.
And Kenny Chesney did a Foo Fighters song and a Tom Petty song for the same exact reason, trying to not just pandering to the audience full of people who weren't only into country, but making sure they were taking it to a place of true over the top excitement, making sure you're getting your money's worth in a stadium activity. And if I don't know if you watched the documentary Get Back, the Peter Jackson
Sure.
document, but the thing that was fascinating for me is, I always thought that entire recording session, from the 1969 TV show that I saw many years after it came out. I don't think I saw it originally. This was the Beatles being broken up by Yoko. And I found that as being a very depressing piece of music, and the album was kind of stained by it. And then all of a sudden, you realize from watching this documentary that Yoko wasn't breaking up the band; John Lennon was, and John Lennon just had Yoko there as a prop to keep, because he was so passive aggressive that he wasn't just going to quit the band and tell them to go screw themselves. They were his friends; they were his mates. So he kind of had her as a prop to say, this is what I'm doing now. But the interesting thing that really stuck with me about that, watching those guys in action, watching them having a chance to create, was they spent more time in that movie playing covers than they did playing their own original music. And at first I'm thinking they were comparing their music to their favorite songs for, validity purposes. And then after I've thought about it and I've seen it a few times, you realize, no, you don't always have the confidence and enthusiasm with a new song. So you're suddenly playing something, a Chuck Berry song, that you have all the confidence and enthusiasm imaginable, and then suddenly you're injecting that into your new song. You're bringing a confidence level that you wouldn't get. And what I'm just saying is watching those guys' technique of how they basically recorded music and how they wrote music. And the fact that you had three guys that were legitimately in competition with one another. And truthfully, look, one of them, George Harrison, wasn't really a songwriter. I mean, he ended up writing some of my absolute favorite Beatles songs. He didn't write it nearly as much as John and Paul, but he wrote just as well as those guys did.
Yeah.
And that just goes to show that it's a craft. Lennon said that over and over. This is a teachable craft, just like cabinet making. You may not become the greatest cabinet maker of all time, but if you really stick with it, you're going to become a damn good cabinet maker. So all I'm trying to say is that Beatles movie gave me tremendous hope. And not that you have to be in a band or anything else, but if you're at least able to apply some of those techniques, I guarantee you they'd work today. Look at a band like The National. They're doing much better music today than they did 20 years ago.
Sure.
Regardless of what they'll tell you or anything else, they're a much better band today. The Grateful Dead were a much better band towards the end of their run. So anyway, I think that I've got to run. So
yeah, we've blown well over the hour. I want to thank you for coming on here. Are there any words you want to leave? You've left me with so many great pieces of insight and definitely advice of how to approach the coming future, but is there anything else you want to leave the folks with now until we get you on here again?
I would like for you to please go to the St. Cecilia's Spotify page and listen to those 4 songs. They may not be your cup of tea, and if you like them, then I can't remember what their Instagram thing is. It might be St. Cecilia, but you can find it from their Spotify
I'll find it.
page.
And I'll put all these links will be in the description.
It would mean the world to me if you would click on, because those are hardworking guys who have really put in the time, and I really believe in them. And the other thing is I'd like to see those guys have a little bit of success so we can use that success and spread it out to a few of our friends, because that's the other thing that's kind of missing. When part of your tribe becomes successful, you can definitely use that success to help the other part of your tribe. And that's kind of missing today. I think it's alive and well in country. I think it's alive and well in hip-hop. It's definitely not alive and well in other forms of music.
Yeah.
Much more competitive. But hey, listen, this is great. James, it's great to see you, and I'm really glad that you're doing this podcast. How exciting is that?
Thank you so much for coming on. I really loved getting to chat with you in super detail, and we'll just coordinate for you to come back here, and we'll go down another hour or two rabbit hole.
To be continued. Thanks
all right,
a million. Be well. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
This has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. The end. With your host, James Oliva. Executive producers, Clint G and James Oliva. That's obnoxious. Sound design, mix, and master by James Oliva. Literally no one cares. For more Totally Legitimate Business, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Totally Legitimate Business, or add us on TikTok at TLB Pod. When will this end? Thank you for listening. Now get back to work. Move it along, buddy.